vertically, horizontally. They changed the settings on YouTube to make it as difficult as possible. The second video on Middle Eastern paganism. The first one you all very much liked, and you want more, which is great to hear. And this is by no means an in-depth study of the subject, but it's just to give you an idea that it's much more complex than what people realize it is. Now, the first video, we concentrated on Jewish paganism, and we're continuing that theme today as Jewish paganism, Jesus polytheism, and we'll get to other things too, but it's kind of the Jewish one kind of unlocks all the others because there's similar archetypes and so on connected to them. So we don't have a name for Jewish polytheism. We don't know of a name for it. Just like we don't know what the pagan Celtic or Nordic people really called their faith. They just had a spiritual belief overall. Like we know in the Egyptian they have Ka, the principle of Ka. They left a name. So for Christians who literally and Orthodox Jews, no, actually that's not true. It wouldn't be for Orthodox Jews. For Christians, fundamentalist Christians, they take the Bible very literally. So they think all the stories that happened in the Bible are real historical events, which it couldn't be further from the truth. Now, we have Judaism, Christianity is divided into two things. We have the first 5 books of the Torah, which is, and also contains some of the Talmud, which is what they call the Old Testament. Then you have the New Testament, which deals with the Synoptic Gospels, and then the letters of Saint John, the Evangelist, and so on, and the Apocalypse and Book of Revelations and all that stuff. So this inability to understand allegory from history is really a fascinating thing in the subject of not only this Jewish polytheism, Jewish paganism, but also in mainstream paganism as well. Now, the defining moment in the history of the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, would be the book of Exodus, which is the story of Moses leading the children of Israel into the promised land and out of Egypt. Now, every serious Jewish Israeli historian will tell you there's absolutely no evidence for it. There's no evidence for it. There's no evidence that the Jews were involved in building the pyramids and all this, or this kind of thing. And there's no evidence of them making the migration from Egypt, getting the 10 Commandments along the way, and then settling eventually in the area around Jerusalem. There's no evidence, no archaeological evidence or anything to support that. And the reason for this is it's allegory. It's allegory. Now, if you look at the Old Testament, you have, interesting, the different books. You really have a struggle with a people moving from polytheism, paganism, and into monotheism. And it's almost like these parables represent, these metaphors and allegories represent are symbolic in a symbolistic way of the movement away from many gods to one God. And even that's not as black and white as you would think. So in Exodus, what the story is that the Jews escaped from Israel being chased by the Pharaoh, and he parted the Red Sea and walked through it. Well, obviously they didn't part the Red Sea, and they didn't walk through it. This was a parting of the waves, a symbolic parting of the waves, or the parting of the waters, where you have the Jews moving away from the polytheistic world, inherited, the Semitic paganism, which would have infused things from Egypt and so on, or maybe even the Egyptian religion influencing the ancient Hebrews, and they're moving away from it back to the Promised Land. So the parting of the seas is the same thing as the parting of the waves, meaning the great division, the great separation between the Hebrews and the polytheism of the ancient world. Now, this you see this thing where they say Moses took 40 years to get from the pyramids to Jerusalem. Uh, and people say you could walk it in 4 days. How's this possible? There's even a meme that goes around. That was the 40 years to get away from polytheism and onto monotheism. It was 40 years of a reformation, a conversion, a new form of Judaism. It's representing 40 years of that's how long it took to initially do it. And so the whole story of Moses going, seeing the burning bush and going, the burning bush is very pagan. It appears in a lot of pagan traditions, or a bush that glows and things like that, or a light emitting from a bush, or a tree. So he goes up to Mount Sinai and gets the Ten Commandments. Now, when he comes back down, he finds that the tribe of the Israelites, the Jews, are worshipping false idols. They've returned to paganism and the golden calf, meaning that they've started, the calf represents Molech, who is a bull, and a zoomorphic, anamorphic human bull hybrid. The body of a man, the head of a bull. Very common in paganism, the whole sacred cow thing, coming out of the Indo-European thing. But it was a calf. It was a golden calf, meaning that they'd only started the shift towards paganism. Again, it didn't happen. These are stories. These are allegories. And so he brought down the Ten Commandments, and the first one, I believe it is, and the most vital one of all is, and people misinterpret this: "Thou shalt not have other gods before me." And they listen to that and go, "That's monotheism." No, what does he actually say? You will not have other gods before me, meaning that Yahweh was saying that I am your primary God. Now, this was happening in paganism all over the world at the time. It was moving towards a monotheistic paganism. So, for instance, in Ireland at this around that time, you had the movement towards the Crom Cruach, from a multiple pantheon of pagan gods. In Persian paganism, the move towards a singular god, Mithra, a one supreme power god, just like Brahman became the supreme power god in Hinduism. But he says, "No other gods before me," meaning that I am your primary deity, but I'm not the only one. And everyone misses out on that. No other gods before me. So it's a polytheistic situation. Now, a covenant was struck with this Yahweh God that they would, if they supremely worshipped him, so this is a form of sacrifice. They had to sacrifice all the other gods, venerating all the other gods, and have a covenant with Yahweh. And this covenant with Yahweh would secure them the promised land. See, it's very interesting, isn't it, when you start thinking outside the sort of like the classical biblical interpretations. The covenant was a sacrifice of their polytheism. Well, not a sacrifice of their polytheism, a sacrifice of their veneration with polytheism. So they had to basically not worship all the other gods and worship this Yahweh God. Again, and even truthers always point out there's loads of passages in the Old Testament where other gods are mentioned, and they all freak out and everything. But that's what it is. They don't understand. Remember, the truthers are American Christian fundamentalists, no matter what country they live in. That's literally what they are. So you have this, this movement into the Promised Land, and around this time you have the things like the banning of graven images. So you had the growth of symbols and so on, but and the Hebrew language is a very symbolic language. It can actually make shapes and pictures. It's a very it's almost like a hieroglyphical type language, no, it's not. And that replaced the drawing of graven images. So now graven images were central to paganism. So, but if you look at the Hebrew alphabet, it is a kind of a graven image in itself, because the shapes form certain things without actually drawing them. So, but in the very earliest remaining Hebrew texts, when they show people, drawings of humans, they often replaced them with animals. It's very interesting. And this is how pork or the pig became an unclean meat. Because of the Jewish gathering into the desert, into this one area, the Exodus, don't think of the Exodus as them all leaving Egypt and making a way in a big line towards the promised land. This means that it was like a renaissance. They were coming in from everywhere to join this new thing, this new form of monotheistic Judaism. And they were being gathered in. And there's lots of stories about gathering in, bringing them in from the countryside, from around Persia, from everywhere. They were coming in. And there would have been Jews that would have stuck with polytheism, but the ones who didn't were coming into the fold. Now, this involved migrations. You cannot herd pigs. You can herd camels, you can herd goats, you can herd sheep, you can herd cattle, you can herd horses, but you can't herd pigs. So because of the pig not being able to be a good herd animal and doesn't do well in a dry environment, it became unclean. You see, parables, allegories, metaphors, based on expediency of existence of the time. And that's how they became, both in Judaism and Islam, a forbidden animal. Now, so speaking of animals, we know that in all pagan traditions, there is an animistic element to it. That, the land is sacred, the Holy Land. The land is the Holy Land. The whole concept of Holy Land is extremely pagan. It's alive. The place is alive because it has a covenant with Jehovah or Yahweh, okay, the Tetragrammaton. So that's an animistic idea. And other things too. So Noah's Ark. Let's talk about Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark is about the people moving away from animistic thinking. So all the animals get into the ark with Noah, and this is a very interesting story because it's almost like, was Noah still? And I think Noah's in Genesis. Was Noah still representing a animistic force? That all the animals were representing the animistic element of Jewish paganism, the 2x2, the breathing, as well as his family. And when they landed, the whole world had been destroyed. Now, I think we read that incorrectly. That's read as the whole world was destroyed by Jehovah, right? And Noah landed the ark on the mountain, and all the animals got out and bred. I think that's read incorrectly. I think Noah and his family were hanging on to animism. And when they say the rest of the world was destroyed, it means the rest of the world became monotheistic, that they knew in their part of the world. And that was almost like a way of putting to bed animism. The sacredness of animals, the animism. The Deluge was, though there is lots of evidence of floods in the ancient world, like everything else, like the Black Pig tsunami in Ireland, they make allegories and metaphors and folklore out of it. So you have that. So you have this continual battle between the struggle out of polytheism and animism and into monotheistic Judaism, covenant with Israel, covenant with, Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton, and the banning of graven images and so on, the fundamentalism of actual law written down. Remember, pagans don't write anything down. Pagans don't have books of instructions. There's no book of instructions in Hinduism. There's the Vedas and all that, but they're not books of instructions. They're books of spiritual teaching, but they're not mandate. You don't have to know them. You don't have to actually follow them word for word. They're sort of like stories and parables, and teaching the nature of reality. They're instructional rather than, mandates as you have in the Abrahamic world. Now this struggle, and this is one of the reasons why there's controversy in many of the books. You often hear about them. Why are these books taken out of the Bible? Is it because it tells the truth about women. God, yeah, there's a lot of that. Yeah, but the real reason they took the books out of the Bible, have been left out of the Bible, and is because they're too pagan. They were too pagan. There was too much paganism. The Book of Enoch's a good example of a controversial book, mentioning things like the Watchers of the Nephilim and all this. And that's all the sons of the daughters of men being impregnated by the angels and stuff like that. This is all paganism. That's very pagan. And you have this like nonsense today where you think the Nephilim and the Watchers are space aliens and stuff like that. No, these were codes for elements within the theological dynamics of the period. Now, the Nephilim being giants and stuff like that, it doesn't necessarily mean they were giants. The word giant translates in many languages to be powerful. So we have to not actually physically think of them as giants. So they may have been. There were giants in the ancient world. In fact, David slewing Goliath is also an element of that as well. That they wanted their simplistic monotheistic thing. So David kills Goliath. So we have the animism dealt with Noah's Ark, and we have the parting of the waters between polytheism and monotheism with Exodus and the parting of the Red Sea. See, water plays a big part in it. And we have the prohibition on graven images, and do not worship other gods. Do not worship your unique, it's other gods. Now, a bigger problem too with this is we have terrible translations. The translations of the Old Testament, even today, and I think this is deliberate, the same reason that the Royal Irish Academy hides those 900 books on the early history of Ireland, because they would just tear shit up if they came out. But a lot of translations are very poor into English and German. A lot of Hebrew terms don't translate well. The classic being Lucifer. Lucifer is not the devil and is not even mentioned in the Old Testament. The term Lucifer is a Greco-Roman god, a pagan god of the morning and the evening star and all that stuff, and the god of extreme insights and flashes of brilliance. And so he's not even mentioned in the Old Testament. That's all bad translation from Old Hebrew into German and English. So we have the situation of the covenant of God, and that's the moves towards it. So you go through all the books of the Bible, and up until as far as Isaiah, it's all about this like leaving the pagan past behind, but not entirely. Not entirely. Like all religions, it bans magic, but you have things like the Hamsa and so on to ward off the evil eye, which is a very common Semitic idea in general. And you have that kind of thing going on. Now you have, in Isaiah, the beginning of Messianic Judaism. Now where we're really talking, when the belief of a Messiah would arrive. And officially when that happened, Elijah, Isaiah, you really had that crossover period in sort of like the mid-late Iron Age, on the eve of the Roman occupation of Judea, where the solidification of everything came into the Messianic Judaism that we have now today. Even that's which became a burn off in Christianity. When we're in Judaism, you have the Messianic tradition to this day, and that was the final monotheistic sort of like threshold that they crossed. The idea that this unique one God would send this son down to free the people. Now, again, the misreading of it. Christian fundamentalists think the Bible is literal, so they think the 12 tribes of Israel being scattered are, scattered all over the world. This is moronic beyond description. And we all know about British Israelism and the concept of, they say crazy things like the tribe of Dan is the two of the Danann and all this nonsense. And they can't read Irish, they can't speak Irish, or even know European mythology. Yes, you did have migrations, but they wouldn't have went very far. They wouldn't have went very far. And in fact, the only one I can find that went any significant distance was a Jewish community who went into Bohemia, who went into, Chechnya today, like on the outskirts of Prague. They've established a synagogue, and they established a synagogue based on finding a megalith, which they believed was built by the people at the time of the first temple. But I can't find anything else. And you're talking then about like 1200s, 1100s. The Jews did wander as business people, but Jews are not, what's the word? Proselytizing. They're not out to convert anybody, which makes them actually the best of the three Abrahamic religions, because they're not trying to convert you. And they set up communities as a way of sort of survival. They, just like the Irish went all over the world, the Chinese went all over the world, the Italians, groups that have an emigration culture bring this with them. But in terms of the tribes of Israel, it would have been very short distances. And it wouldn't have been actual tribes. It would have been different interpretations of the Jewish religion. So, like, think of it as different, denominations of a church. And it's not literal. We're talking about, you know, mythology, basically. Mythology coupled with theology. And so that's how Judaism moved from paganism to monotheism. And it's all given to us in metaphor and allegory and mythology within the first three quarters of the Old Testament, especially. And then because it goes from Messianic Judaism into what we know Christianity and the Judaism of today. So where does that lead us today? Well, the Jews never really moved away from paganism. There's the whole thing of the Kabbalah. Now, the Kabbalah was briefly indulged in the Middle East, but Jewish communities living in the south of France in the Languedoc, particularly among the Cathars, developed the tree of life concept within the Kabbalah directly based on pagan leftovers from the Middle Ages that were still existing in the Middle Ages. So Jewish mysticism incorporated or reincorporated a lot of paganism in terms of that kind of the Kabbalah. Today in Israel and in other countries, like in places like New York, you have Jewish neo-paganism, which is actually treated very well and quite great respect by mainstream Jews, because they just see it as like, an harmless animism that is compatible with, say, Reform Judaism. You wouldn't get the same answer from an Orthodox Jew, but Reform Judaism, which is the most common form of Judaism. So, and you have like growing neo-pagan groups in Israel and in other countries around the world where Jewish people are. It's definitely a revival, and it seems to be quite a healthy and a happy one. There's no, they're culturally Jewish, but in terms of their spiritual tradition, they're theologically pagan. But the two things are very compatible for the reasons I just told you. Even, you see like those Orthodox rabbis where they constantly study scripture, they're constantly studying the Old Testament. That's about trying to distinguish metaphor from history. You see, this is why they don't take that stuff literally. It's all about decoding the mythology and so on. And so that's it. That's the Jewish part of the pagan story. But it's an important one because it unlocks all the rest. So, I know if you're out there and you're a fundamentalist Christian, you're probably like, smoking a crack pipe right now. But that's just how it is. That's the truth. The Bible is not, even the Jews didn't take it literally. Yet they took it literally in terms of like their covenant with God and the Holy Land, or the Promised Land. That's all. But they understand there's a strong metaphorical element to it. It's only fundamental Christians that seem to take it actually literal. Actually literal. And this is very weird to me. Like they build replicas of, and especially in America, they build replicas of Noah's Ark and this kind of thing. The allegory of Noah and the Ark and the animals is no different than, say, the Tuatha De Danann coming to Ireland on a ship made in a storm from their destroyed homelands. It's everywhere. Or the godly king race that arrived in northern Britain with new forms of agriculture. Remember the Fertile Crescent and all that and stuff? You know, the Jews brought new forms of agriculture, probably picked up in other parts of the Middle East where they lived. And it's a fascinating topic. So in the next one we'll probably dive into something else like Persian paganism or Aramaic paganism and or something in that line. So Arabic paganism, something. I think I'll do Arabic paganism next. So remember, paganism, it's not just for Christmas. It's for Hanukkah too.